what we found is that folks that were drawn for a bed at Karluk Manor 1 year later were still housed. Mm-hmm. And for at least 30 of the individuals that lived there, that might have been the most successful run of housing that they had put together in some cases decades. Mm-hmm. That successful run of 1 year stably housed for some individuals became the springboard from which they went out and earned a CNA, mm-hmm. got a job, got a driver's license and access to a vehicle, and increased independence.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Bree. The purpose of this podcast is to tell stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Dr. Travis Hedwig, Assistant Dean of the Division of Population Health Sciences at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. He is co-editor of a forthcoming book entitled Housing, Homelessness, and Social Policy in the Urban North. The book brings together leading scholars from Alaska, the Canadian North, and Greenland who examine the factors contributing to housing and homelessness and how to develop policies that respond to our northern realities. Travis was an instrumental researcher in Anchorage's early foray into housing first policy with Karluk Manor. Karluk Manor was Anchorage's first permanent housing project that did not require any level of sobriety for the chronically unhoused individuals that were chosen to stay there. Although that project was met with fierce community resistance, now, over 10 years later, it is seen as a great success and guides our commitment to housing first policy. Speaking of current homelessness policy, Alexis Johnson, the municipality's housing and homelessness coordinator, joins us to discuss Anchorage's emergency cold weather shelter plan for this coming winter. Travis Hedwig, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Glen Cove, New York, in Long Island, Nassau County, North Shore of Long Island.
And what do you do?
I just got a new position as the Assistant Dean of the Division of Population Health Sciences in the College of Health at UAA. Prior to that, I was working as a faculty where I had just earned the rank of Associate Professor with tenure in 2022. I first came to the Division of Population Health Sciences in 2013 as a postdoctoral research fellow for the Institute for Circumpolar Health Studies.
And what were you researching when you came here in 2013?
Housing, and specifically housing first. I was part of the evaluation team that did the work for Karluk Manor, which was Anchorage, indeed Alaska's first housing first projects. So we evaluated Karluk Manor and South Cushman in Fairbanks.
I want to talk about Karluk Manor, but before that, tell us how you went from being a kid in New York to, getting on the road to moving to Alaska to do housing first.
Thanks. So I'm a big believer in higher education. I think everything that we know about educational and occupational opportunity suggests that if we can create pathways to accessing higher education, people are going to earn more over the course of a working career, and we have a lot more opportunities and pathways. Consistent with that, I was always the kind of student that wanted to find the best deals on my education. So I'm a big believer in 4-year comprehensive open enrollment universities. So I'm a product of the SUNY system, which I think is arguably one of the best comprehensive statewide systems in the United States.
State University of New York.
State University of New York, College at Plattsburgh, which is in the northern tip of New York, about 50 miles south of Montreal. And I got really interested and eyes wide open about the power and possibility of applied research. My background and training is in applied medical anthropology, and I've just always been interested in bringing our research skills to bear on real-world emerging problems. I had an opportunity and was fortunate enough to go to a school that required a practicum, and I did a practicum with Hope Community Resources here in Alaska. The former CEO of Hope Community Resources, Roy Scheller, is a graduate of SUNY Plattsburgh. And here we had an opportunity for SUNY kids to spend the summer in Alaska. It was an internship looking at disability and community inclusion. I spent the summer in Kodiak, Alaska, 1999, and I lived and worked at a group home with adults who experienced developmental disabilities. Fell in love with the work, fell in love with the place, went back to New York and graduated with my undergrad. moved up to Alaska and enrolled as a master's student in the applied anthropology program here at UAA. So I am an alumni. Go Seawolves. After that, I consider myself kind of a practicing researcher. So I spent a couple of years as a case manager, again, working for Hope Community Resources. I had a mentor that believed in me and that I trusted, who said, if you're going to do the PhD, do it now while you still got the fire in the belly. I left a couple of years and I chose the University of Kentucky for my doctoral studies, specifically because of their interest and expertise in rural health. So I'm really interested in population health vulnerabilities. I'm interested in engaging community, rolling up our sleeves, figuring out what the problems are, engaging diverse stakeholders from across sectors to understand what the problems are, collect different perspectives, and somewhere in the middle, we find solutions that work for our community. And it usually starts just by recognizing and honoring and respecting that we have differences of opinion. In a democracy, that's an asset.
So, were your parents academics?
No. But my grandmother, who died at the age of 101, had a master's degree and taught 50 years in my hometown. And she said something to me when I was young that always stuck with me, which was an earned degree can't be taken away. You know, you can lose a job, you can lose relationship, you can lose other things, but the hard work that goes into an earned degree is something that can't be taken away. I do come from a family of teachers, and I've just always really believed in the power of higher education to help really wrestle with the world's problems.
So you've been in Kodiak in 99, gone back, finished your schooling, moved here to do your master's at UAA.
Yes.
And then went to Kentucky for your PhD and then came back. I guess, does that kind of get us near Karluk Manor?
Yeah, but I suppose I should back up a little bit because while I was doing my master's degree here at UAA, again in applied anthropology, I was really interested in how to bring anthropological perspectives to bear on problem solving in the everyday sense. I had an opportunity, again, working for Hope. I was doing some case management. I was the interim network director of Hope in Utqiagvik, Barrow. I spent some time in the YK Delta working for the Army Corps of Engineers doing environmental health stuff, environmental risk assessments. I was technically an archaeologist in terms of my title, but I really worked as a cultural resource manager, a cultural anthropologist. We had conversations with elders around some of the coastal erosion work happening in Western Alaska right now, particularly like Newtok and some of the relocation efforts. I was actually in Newtok in 2005 when some of that work began, and here we are in 2023. Still, that move is still underway. So it was really exciting to be a part of the sort of emerging. How do we deal with climate change, ecological responses in our more vulnerable coastal areas in Alaska?
So when you talk about anthropology being used for, modern problem solving, can you give an example? Like, what does that mean?
So I consider myself a mixed methodologist. So we use quantitative methods, statistical analysis. We might engage, learn about available data sets and bring them to bear to help us understand what might be going on. But we also do different kinds of community engagement, qualitative methods that might include things like cultural consensus analysis, which is some work we did with Karluk Manor, which I can get into in a minute. I really think of it as a mixed methodological approach. How can we collect data that helps us make informed choices, policy choices, program choices, with, of course, the ultimate goal being improving the health of populations, especially where we know there's population health vulnerabilities.
Okay, so Karluk Manor was Anchorage's first Housing First initiative. I guess talk a little bit at first about what Housing First is, what that philosophy is, and how Karluk Manor was the test run.
Okay. Housing First is really a philosophy that takes as its core, if you stabilize somebody's physical environment first and foremost, you can then approach somebody in a new light to perhaps engage in treatment or other social services and supports. There are some core tenets, which is the idea of an offer of housing is supposed to be separated from other offers of service. It's housing without precondition of sobriety or treatment compliance. That's controversial for many. But what the international research has revealed around Housing First, this is now a very well-studied model, is that all things being equal, once that physical environment is stabilized, an individual is more likely to engage in services, whether it's treatment, whether it's primary preventive health care. So Karluk Manor was kind of our test run. We had in the downtown, downtown Seattle had a project-based Housing First site. And we, after several conversations with them, modeled our Karluk Manor project-based site after what was happening in Seattle. Now, there's basically two main models. One of them is called project-based, where for Karluk Manor, it was a converted hotel. I believe it's 46 units. Everybody lives on site. You have housing support supervisors. You have access to case management and other services right there. The other primary model is called scattered site, which would be housing first units that maybe are within apartment buildings, or you'd have a certain percentage of the total allotted for housing vulnerability or even for disability and other things. So those are the two main models, project-based and scattered site. We have not yet figured out how to do scattered site in Anchorage, so there are a couple of project-based sites now. But this was our first attempt at it. And we at UAA, at the time I was working for the Institute for Circumpolar Health Studies, got the evaluation contract. We were simply looking at 1 year prior to and 1 year after. We looked at emergency service utilization. How many nights in the year prior to Housing First did somebody spend in ASP, sleep-off center? How many nights in jail? How many nights in an ER? So we looked at high-cost emergency services for what we know are high-frequency utilizers of those services. Tracked them year prior. We got memorandums of agreement with the municipality, tribal health system. We had access to lots of data.
And this was like 2013 to 2014?
Ish. Yeah, I think 15 it ended. Yeah. So 1 year prior to, just simple records, how many times, frequency counts. Then after somebody moved in, 1 year after, same thing.
So there's 46 units and obviously more than 46 people who would be interested in this sort of service.
Yes.
How did you decide who got to be part of this study?
Great question. At that time, there was a waiting list in town. That waiting list was designed to prioritize the most vulnerable. So there was a vulnerability index. That vulnerability index was developed out of Boston.
What made people more vulnerable?
Physical disabilities, mental and behavioral health challenges, substance use disorders, and severe mental illness. There was a box to check for veteran status.
So folks that would be especially challenged to go to a, leasing now, like to show up at an apartment complex and ask for a room and get one.
Yes.
So this was really going for the people who were not going to be able to do that.
Correct. And what we found is that it wasn't just like a single strike. What we found is that these things clustered together in sometimes very intensive ways. So there was a weighted index to determine who got drawn from the wait list. The unfortunate part was there simply wasn't enough units to accommodate the wait list. But it was an attempt to make sure that we were prioritizing those with the most need.
Well, I was kind of asking, so that folks understood that you weren't weighting it towards people who would be more likely to be successful. It sounds like it was actually weighted in the opposite direction.
Yes. And that actually contributed to, I think, some of the political blowback or maybe some of the stigma, because in that first year, several individuals died. Part of that, some thought that might have had to do with, Housing First is enabling. Maybe this wouldn't have happened if people were allowed to drink. And what we learned is that there was a lot more going on. The individuals that did pass away in that first year maybe had other chronic health ailments. Maybe some of them were older. That was another. Age was a factor. And then several other chronic health vulnerabilities that contributed to that. But as you... Yeah.
I was getting nervous. Before we get into like the pushback so much, what did the data show in terms of what you were looking at? The use of emergency department visits and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
How did their utilization prior to being housed versus after being housed, how did it work out?
As predicted, the number and frequency of emergency service utilization dramatically went down. But there's more to the story. We saw it's perhaps best thought of as cost shifts. So we saw a shift away from emergency care and a shift towards primary and preventive care.
Which
Not
is
surprisingly.
cheaper. Yeah.
Cheaper, but still costly. Yeah,
Right.
it still cost money. And so there was just show us that we're saving money. Hard to show in terms of a bottom line dollar amount. But we were able to show a demonstrable shift away from those emergency services, which, as you say, are more costly. We also found, and this is probably one of the most important and consistent measures across Housing First studies, is housing retention. So what we found is that folks that were drawn for a bed at Karluk Manor, 1 year later were still housed. And for at least 30 of the individuals that lived there, that might have been the most successful run of housing that they had put together in some cases decades. That successful run of 1 year stably housed for some individuals became the springboard from which they went out and earned a CNA, got a job, got a driver's license and access to a vehicle, and increased independence associated with that. I think I mentioned to you, we did one interview with a woman who for the first time reconnected with family in a small rural Alaska community. Nobody had, didn't even know about whether or not this person was alive. And this was the first time after several decades, 4 generations of women sharing stories in an apartment. So you now have somebody able to invite family, and the kind of reconnection that was happening was really pretty amazing, powerful stories. Right around that same time, Samuel Johns started a Facebook page called Forget Me Not, which was basically an attempt to help people connect with family. And we know in Alaska, in some cases, there's profound disruption. People might come to Alaska to leave their home community for seasonal migration or seasonal labor, wind up in Anchorage, and then getting back home is challenging. Couple of decades go by, and we were seeing family reconnection after pretty profound rupture, and being able to participate in that and have somebody tell their story from their perspective, like the value of home and place, and being able to open a door for a family member. We also heard that because people had such long histories of living in street situations, not used to having an apartment with 4 walls, setting up a tent in the middle of an apartment because it took some time and adjustment. So a lot of just interesting things where people had an opportunity to share 1 year later what was it like to have stable housing. So housing retention is one of the most important measures we looked at. We also did, I mentioned before around methodology, we did a method called cultural consensus analysis, where we wanted to understand some of the community perceptions. We engaged the Fairview Business Association. We interviewed a couple people and like neighbors. What does it mean to be a good neighbor? What are some examples of not being a good neighbor? And we were trying to assess to what extent community members of Anchorage saw the existence of a Housing First site as a threat, a safety threat, a health and sanitation threat, and a cultural. Go ahead.
What did the neighbors say?
Well, we got everything across the board. But one of the interesting things from the neighbor perspective is at first there was a lot of not in my backyard, the NIMBY, classic NIMBYist, a lot of protests. People were hanging liquor bottles on the corner of Karluk Manor right across from the Lucky Wishbone. And there was a lot of, this isn't going to work. I don't want people defecating on my property. And understandable concerns, I suppose. And what we found was that 1 year later, we repeated those interviews, and people were identifying residents of Karluk Manor as good neighbors. They do a bunch of community engagement events. There's a few times a year where people can come in and check the place out. And they do a lot of public service and outward facing kind of things. And a lot of the folks we interviewed 1 year later were, the perception was starting to shift a little bit.
Was there behavior that would cause someone to be asked to leave Karluk Manor?
Violence, stealing, there's hard drugs. I think those are the 3. Stealing, violence, hard drugs.
And did people get asked to leave?
It did happen, but fairly rare. You'd be surprised that once you create an opportunity, so there's a little bit of it operates similar to a co-op where there is an expectation that people are putting in time to the collective, whether it's cleaning, whether it's taking turns with some of the janitorial responsibilities, and maybe it's a pride in ownership. that for the most part, people recognize the value of having that bed, especially as the months start to get colder. Here we are heading into the colder season. I don't think anybody that lived there took for granted for 1 minute the fact that they had housing.
So it sounds like, from your perspective, Karluk Manor was a big success.
It was, but it took time because there was a lot of pushback in Anchorage, at least initially. I think what the data show is that it's been a success. It's been a success in terms of our typical housing measures, housing retention, emergency service utilization, but it's also a success in terms of turning the corner on the perception. We know the model works. The Alaska Public Health Association a few years ago it passed a health policy resolution recognizing housing first as an international best practice.
Is a pretty not rarely held view by some folks who are criticizing housing first, is that these folks need help with their substance use, they need help with their mental health, they need those things to be done before they can be trusted with an apartment or a reconverted hotel room so that they don't trash the property.
I'd like to see the data. That's usually my starting point. I'd like to check out, what evidence are we using to make these kind of claims. I can say my time there, and I spent a year there, just about every day there. You do hear about things. Sometimes people cause damage, and they're responsible for paying for that damage. Everybody that lives there is on a lease and paying rent. It's a sliding fee scale, and there would be an expectation that you're responsible to repair damages that you've caused. I know one common one, especially around activities of daily living and severe mental illness. What about kitchens and cooking?
Right.
And there are differences. So not every apartment is equipped with a kitchen. It's something that does need to be watched very closely. To my knowledge, there hasn't been a unit that's burned down. They have a pretty good structure in place. That's a balance of independence and safety.
Well, I guess in the same way that you want to see the data showing that there was damage caused, do you have data showing that damage wasn't caused? I mean, is Karluk Manor in fairly good condition now?
Last time I've seen it, it seems to be. I mean, it's sustaining itself. They haven't shuttered their doors. It's been open now, I think, over 10 years. I think the proof is in the pudding on some of the housing retention measures. Proof is in the pudding on some of the emergency service utilization metrics. And we have those data. I'm happy to share that with anybody that's interested. And I haven't heard of otherwise, but as I said, eyes wide open, right? And we use the best information that we have to make the best, most informed choice we can at the time.
Well, and something, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the idea of housing first isn't that we're not going to give people alcohol and substance abuse treatment. It's not that we're not going to provide mental health. It's just that we're going to give them keys to their room first. They're going to have a room that they can sleep in tonight. They don't have to be sober any length of time in order to get that key the first night.
And that's the conceptual shift that's hard for people. I mean, that really is the paradigm shift, is to what extent do you need to achieve a state of sobriety before engaging in all those other services? I think housing first shows that it can happen at the same time. What we've also learned, and we actually collected data on this, substance use metrics, like just in terms of raw consumption, how many drinks per day, before, during, after. I would say mostly it remains the same. Very small number for whom it increased, and a significant chunk for whom it decreased. There was a handful of people that achieved a state of total sobriety. So under a harm reduction kind of approach, we are moving in the right direction. We had a photocopied liquor bottle, and we would ask people, like, how much would you consume in a single sitting? How much would you consume in a day? How much would you consume if you were sitting around with a group of friends? And we did collect data on substance use patterns. I think the average number of drinks consumed per day, I hesitate a little bit to share. It was high. It was, I want to say, I'll have to go double check these data, but it was in the ballpark of 40 drinks a day. 1 year after, I think the average number of drinks consumed was down to like 15, still a lot. But when you had a chunk of people that...
So these are like people, individuals drinking 40 drinks a day?
Average, yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so that would be measured, a can of beer or a shot, or we'd had a bottle with measured out. Yeah. And I'd have to go back and double check those numbers, but it was around 40. It's a lot. And 1 year later, I think the average was in the ballpark of 15 or 17. And
so they've reduced by
roughly half.
Way more than half.
Yeah. And there were some that had achieved total sobriety. And then you ask people, well, is it challenging for you to maintain your sobriety when there's other apartments and other neighbors that you have that aren't? Because that's an important question. Do people that have made a choice to maintain their sobriety, do we need to pluck them out and segregate them in housing with other people who are choosing sobriety? Sometimes yes. I mean, the answer is yes and. We need a diversity of housing strategies to meet the diverse needs of a vulnerable population. But we did, for the most part, hear from people that they didn't at all feel challenged in their sobriety by having neighbors that choose to drink.
I'm going to transition to talking about your book.
Sure.
You had a book. It was supposed to have come out this year. I don't know. Is it out yet?
It's got a 2023 copyright date. It's scheduled for publication in March of 2024.
Okay.
The University of Toronto Press.
And what's the book called?
It's called Housing, Homelessness, and Social Policy in the Urban North. And it is a edited volume, a collection of a dozen or so authors from Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, really representing all sectors, academics, community-based programs. We had some politicians. The mayor of Yellowknife contributed to one of the papers. And it's kind of an interesting story how it came together, really right on the heels of the Karluk Manor evaluation in 2015, really was the genesis of this book. Myself and a colleague in anthropology named Sally Carhair, we organized...
And where is she?
She was in anthropology. She left. I think she works for the Boys and Girls Club now.
Okay.
Yep. Still doing a lot of this work. She's very connected to the community. And after the Karluk Manor, we were both part of the Alaska Anthropological Association, otherwise known as the Little AAAs. And we put together a convening at the Lusac Library. It was called Northern Voices on Homelessness. And we had academics, we had state officials, we had community leaders, nonprofits, and we had a huge faction of people who had lived experience with homelessness. And we brought all these players together and we talked about the issues. We shared findings from some of the evaluation. And we invited one of the contributors to that book, Nick Falvo, who is a policy writer in Canada. And that was really the beginning of the genesis of this book. In 2015, we had this huge convening. That led to an international collaboration at the Society for Applied Anthropology in Vancouver, British Columbia in 2016. That's where I met the lead author of the book, Julia Christensen, internationally respected author on housing and homelessness in Canada. And we organized a panel at the Society for Applied Anthropology in Vancouver on the circumpolar dimensions of housing, with the idea that there are some unique aspects of our circumpolar community that includes Alaska, Canada, Scandinavia, Russia. And Julia organized a second convening in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories in 2018. And that's where all of the authors that contributed to that book convened in Yellowknife for 3 days, and we shared topics, we shared our papers, and that ultimately became the individual chapters of the book. It's taken a long time to get to this point. COVID happened. After the pandemic, we added another chapter, so now there's a housing and homelessness in the shadow of COVID, which is a new conclusion that we added, and that will be part of the sort of newest iteration.
So the book is Alaska, Canada, and Greenland.
Yes.
Not Scandinavia or Russia.
No, but that's would be an area of growth for us. I mean, we just started. Those are the folks that represent. Those are the folks that showed up at the conference, and that's just kind of the organic nature of how this developed. But there is interest. I mean, we're connecting with other collaborators. This year in 2024, the International Congress of Arctic Social Sciences is being held in Norway. So we've got some Norwegian colleagues that are interested. And obviously room to expand here. But we just started with the authors that we had with us in the room.
Can you talk about some of the things that you were surprised were the same for all the groups, and then some of the major differences.
Sure. One of the things that's the same is that we have shared geography, shared linguistic and cultural histories, shared histories vis-a-vis settler colonialism, patterns of urban cores and kind of spoken wheel model like we see with the tribal health system. Very similar in Canada, very similar in Greenland in terms of major urban centers and then small, mostly rural communities, and all of the seasonal migration and movement around that. Similarities across our circumpolar north, and that was really the starting point. There's something unique to the look of homelessness in the far north. Not to mention things like cold weather exposures, wildlife encounters, other vulnerabilities that are unique to the north. Some things that are different probably get into our politics. So Canada has a socialized healthcare system,
which I would think would make it 1,000 times better to be homeless in Canada than to be homeless here. But
you would think, yes and no. I mean, access to things like housing vouchers seem to be a little bit more prevalent. Some of the tribal housing authorities talk to the municipal and provincial authorities. The relationship there is much more smooth than I perceive it to be here. Just people communicating with one another more. One issue in Alaska is pushing housing vouchers out far and wide. You have to have a HUD satellite office to distribute them. And if you don't have one of those in your community, where are the vouchers coming from? What mechanisms do we have to help subsidize for that housing? That is a night and day difference. Canada has a more robust policy infrastructure. But their numbers are similar. I mean, they still have a lot of challenges, and that's where we get into some of the urban and rural focus, some of the historical similarities, rapid culture change within a period of a generation or two, really tied to things like natural resource development and urbanization, among other things. And then similarly in Canada, Greenland. Greenland is a home rule country. Has a colonial past that's connected to Denmark. Yes, since I think 2013 now, it's now sovereign home rule. I forgot the term for it. Basically, sovereign state. But they have really interesting social welfare policy as well, to where you'd think that homelessness wouldn't exist, but it sure does.
Right. I think. I'll just put it out there how we met. I met you at the door. You're my constituent.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned that you were working on a book where you were looking at homelessness in Greenland. And I said, they have homeless people in Greenland? Like, right. It's so weird.
Right.
But they do have homeless people in Greenland.
They do have homeless people in Greenland. And that's where we might also see some vulnerabilities vis-a-vis our indigenous history. Greenlandic peoples speak a language that's mutually intelligible. Some of our Nubiak dialects up here. So there's linguistic consistency across the Canadian Arctic that I think plays out in shared histories, shared culture, shared ways of being, thinking, and knowing about home and place and belonging. Lots of similarity there. I think I told you a story when we were at Yellowknife. One of the issues that comes up here in Alaska is that we don't have enough housing stock. Mm-hmm. Where do we get materials to build? Mm-hmm. How do we get materials out to rural Alaska? The late Don Young, when I was on the state Alaska Housing and Homelessness Coalition, had said kind of tongue-in-cheek, well, we live right here next to a military base. Why wouldn't we send up those Connex shipping containers and come up with all kinds of creative ways to retrofit them, stack them, double wide them? We can have ecologically responsive foundations. Like if you can get the technology right on the foundations. And it was interesting because we were in this room in Yellowknife and everybody started laughing. Like, why would you turn a shipping container into a home? Like, what? Like, are we really lowering the bar that much to where we're going to offer a shipping container as housing? The Greenland faction was like, what? Like, what are you guys talking about? First of all, what is a Connex? Had to be explained. Oh, these little shipping containers that we use to, barge supplies. And they kind of joked and said, we've been building housing out of shipping containers for years here. And they have like some really interesting housing complexes that are built out of materials that are available.
Well, and I think I may have told you that when I was deployed to Kosovo, all of our buildings were made out of connexes, and you're able to make really interesting structures, much different than folks would expect, with vaulted ceilings, and you can stack them up, you can tear out the floors, tear out the roof. You can make really huge, interesting buildings with long hallways and windows, and it doesn't, where it would feel like you were in a building, you wouldn't realize that you were in a bunch of connexes.
Right. There's so much potential.
Are you able to compare in that way to say, like, out of Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, who has the worst homeless problem?
I don't know that we have good data that could be compared in a apples,
or I guess if you did like
kind of way.
Anchorage versus Toronto versus, what's the capital of Greenland? Nuuk.
Yeah. I think you could just do like your point in time kind of counts. Like, you know, in the United States we have, and they do this in Canada too, like that your one night a year where they do their best guess estimate. Yeah. I think if we just looked at crude point in time count measures, we would be the most severe in terms of point on any single given night. The number of unsheltered individuals in our community right now is probably highest here.
Would you say that Canada and Greenland are managing the problem better?
I don't know that I can say that. I feel like they have a more robust policy infrastructure, and people are talking to one another more. So as a result, they're able to innovate. They're able to try new things, like try a new program. Hey, we have some evidence that this works. Let's cobble together some funding and try it. And we can evaluate it and test and assess whether it works. If it works, let's do more of this. If it doesn't work, well, maybe we won't do that next time. So it does seem to be a little bit more wiggle to try innovate. And I think that's what we need.
Is there less red tape or pushback towards implementing a new strategy?
I think, bureaucracy is bureaucracy. So there is red tape, but it might be slightly more navigable. Very much the same in terms of the NIMBYist. Very much the same in terms of the stigma and the stereotyping, the morality, the undeserving versus deserving poor. Those kinds of community conversations are actually quite similar. And you'd think that because they have a little bit more policy depth to respond, that community members would perhaps see the result of that. But the NIMBYist phenomenon is alive and well there, just the same.
I'm thinking about how to ask this next question. What I hear from some folks is that there are certain people who choose to be homeless and are choosing not to work and are choosing to figure out how to take advantage of the system. And I guess, can you speak a little bit about that? I mean, I would assume that if you look hard enough, you can find any type of person anywhere. So if they wanted to find that example of someone who is able-bodied and could be working an assortment of different labors, but isn't, is choosing not to. But I would guess that that's probably not the typical person.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, you're going to run into all kinds of folks. It's a constrained choice at best. If we're going to say it's a choice, it's a constrained choice at best. And I don't think anyone's like pulling the wool over anyone's eyes. It's not like, I got you. I don't think anybody thinks about it that way. Even in some of the Karluk Manor work that we were doing, there was genuine appreciation for the fact that there was an offer of housing on the table. It wasn't like, I got you, sucker.
Well, I guess another way of putting it is that there are some people who are afraid that if we give everyone their own room, that folks who are homeless in Los Angeles, who are living on the street, would tell their friends, let's get to Anchorage because Anchorage houses everybody. And that there's this fear that you'll have homeless folks from across the country migrating here to take advantage of our housing first policy.
Right. I'd rather deal with that problem when we get there. I don't see that ever being a problem for us, honestly. We're not leading the nation in our housing approaches. So I don't think we have to worry about the floodgates opening.
Who is leading the nation in their housing approaches, in your opinion?
I think it works a little bit better in medium and smaller sized communities when you can create real community buy-in. It's like where grassroots meets smart policy. Where we see things spiraling out of control right now do seem to be in really large urban areas, and that's where I think maybe you're getting more of a lifestyle, like maybe young, like age is a factor. If you go to a place like Portland or something and check out the street population, I'd say it's generally younger. Whereas here, you're going to get more veterans, you're going to get more, decades of chronic street homelessness. So I do think in the larger urban areas, you might get more of that. Maybe this is a vulnerability prioritization kind of question that. Where do we set the bar in terms of individuals that really need help right now, and individuals that maybe with some supported employment or other kinds of resources that maybe somebody would only need temporary housing or. So I don't know I can't think of a single city that's doing it well, but I think. I don't know, some of the smaller communities, even in Alaska, Fairbanks is doing some interesting things. Southern Kenai Peninsula Coalition, the Wellness Coalition is doing neat stuff. Down in Southeast Alaska, Sitka, they have a housing coalition that's pretty robust.
They had a groundbreaking on Sunday.
Yeah.
To build, I think, 12 small cabins.
Yeah, I even think we need to tell the story of Juneau housing first. My understanding is that the community perception is really shifted in Juneau because the housing first model there has been quite successful. Maybe you know more about that, but I think we have success stories to tell right here in Alaska, and it does seem to be those medium-sized communities where you can chip away at the community perception. And then when communities see the positive results of what can happen with this kind of model, then maybe that NIMBYist attitude starts to slide back a little bit. And I see that happening in Southern Kenai, and I see it happening in Sitka and Southeast. And I had heard there were some pretty positive things happening in Juneau as well.
What is, if there was some big picture takeaways that you would want listeners to have about housing and homelessness in Alaska, what do you want people to know? What are some misconceptions maybe that you'd like to clear up?
Well, I mean, the biggest one that I like to hone in on is that we're talking about human beings. Pathways into homelessness are extremely complex, and they're linked to mental illness, behavioral health conditions, addictions, traumatic family histories, sometimes profound trauma. In Alaska, we lead the nation in adverse childhood experiences. Within this population who experiences homelessness, double that. At Karluk Manor, when we did a crude trauma measure using the adverse childhood experiences questionnaire, and average age score 8 and 9, and 10 is the highest you can get. And there's 10 questions. It's either a yes or no. 10's like the worst. That means you've got all the strikes. Everything we know about ACEs is that your risk, not in a predictive way, but in your statistical likelihood of suffering from all kinds of health ailments is astronomically higher. So for me, I think there's a human lens. My wish for my fellow community members was that we could just pause and recognize that what you see on the street is a human being with a story. I've never met somebody who chose that personally. I've never met somebody who said, I've chosen this for myself. Quite the opposite. If you take time to connect with somebody as a human being, you might learn about their story and might build some empathy around that. And then out of that, we develop a community that's more sensitive and responsive to the needs of our most vulnerable. On the other hand, these are challenging issues. Policy is linked to economics. We live in a state where people like to hold on to as much tax dollars as possible. I think there are ways to do this responsibly. I think there are ways to do this while being good stewards of the public dollar. We have data that show that this is possible. We have data that show this is possible for Anchorage, for Alaska, for the United States, and elsewhere in the world. I am happy to share this information with individuals. I want to have more conversation. We need all hands on deck. There's no wrong answer. We need to discuss this. When I'm in my classroom with students, same thing. What does it mean to be an engaged citizenry? What does it mean to give a shit about some of these problems? And when we approach it with a human lens, I think we learn that we have a lot more in common than we don't. And that is really what I'd like us all to leave with, because as I have students that tell me this all the time, I'm never much more than a missed paycheck or two away from being in that situation myself. And there's also the human lens. At a time when our economics are tough, we've got a lot of families out there working hard to just squeak by. And it doesn't take much to set in motion things that could be truly life-changing. Throw in a little grief and loss and trauma and addiction, and it's a complex onion. But if we pause and start to peel back the layers, we can address this. And one of the things that's been so neat to watch about Karluk Manor, and I don't think it's the be-all, end-all. I'm more of a scattered site guy, personally. It works best when units are interlaced in the community. That's when we build neighborliness. It's the same argument for some of the special needs housing grants. You've got a big apartment complex. What percentage of those units will go to individuals with disabilities? What percentage of those units could go to individuals with experiencing homelessness or other acute family homelessness or transitional housing or rapid rehousing? There are lots of different housing types to meet the need for lots of different types of homelessness. Similarly, we need more housing stock. When low housing stock and low vacancy come together, it's a bit of a perfect storm for anybody. And then when you throw in additional layers of vulnerability, it's not hard for me to see why so many people are struggling.
Remind us one more time the name of the book.
Housing, Homelessness, and Social Policy in the Urban North.
And it's coming out in spring 2024.
March of 2024.
March 2024.
University of Toronto Press.
Travis, Hedwig, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you.
Something that came up during my conversation with Travis was that neither of us were able to clearly explain what Anchorage's plan for this coming winter is. So I am very grateful to have Alexis Johnson, the municipality's housing and homeless coordinator, explain what Anchorage's plan for this coming winter is with regards to shelter for our homeless population. This conversation took place in her office at the Anchorage Health Department.
Alexis Johnson, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it.
You're the housing and homelessness coordinator for the municipality of Anchorage.
Yes, and I oversee all our housing and homelessness efforts at the Anchorage Health Department.
Thank you so much for talking to me today. I wanted to just get a very broad overview about the plan for this winter with regards to homelessness.
Yeah, absolutely. So, good news. The Anchorage Assembly fully funded emergency cold weather sheltering operations through the end of 2023. So we are secure in, knowing where the funding is and having that available to us. Anchorage Health Department has planned for 400 people seeking shelter. This is a 40% decrease from 775 people that would have been seeking shelter in April of this year when the Sullivan Arena, the Aviator, and the Alex closed. That is because of new investments in housing facilities, hotel conversion. So earlier this year, we saw the guest house coming online. That brought 131 beds. The Lakeshore, which is 46 beds. The Golden Lion, which has been a long-awaited project with 80 beds. And then we're waiting on the Barrett Inn to come online, which is 96 beds. So you start to see 775 people seeking shelter in April, new housing units coming online that are targeted at specific populations. And therefore, when people move into housing, they don't seek shelter. And so going into winter, we have 400 beds that we'd like to cover. We currently have an intent to bid out, and we have had quite a number of responses from facilities like hotels willing and ready to open up shop when we're ready. And that date is October 16th. It's a Monday.
My understanding is that there would still be need for a congregate shelter with 150 beds.
Yeah, so the Assembly has put into code that any facility that shelters people in a congregate setting can only have up to 150 people. Initial responses that we received from the request for information, which is basically our way of asking, hey, are you guys interested? We believe that we would have 372 non-congregate beds. So we're looking between 20-ish people to 150-ish people in a congregate setting, but a lot lower than we've had historically with Sullivan Arena.
I don't know if you can answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. With Travis, who's on the podcast this week, he talked a lot about Karluk Manor and how when they were doing non-congregate shelter there, they were placing some of the folks with the most needs there. And I guess, do we triage such that the folks with the highest needs would get their own room, or are those the folks who are more likely to end up in congregate? And I guess I'm just wondering, right now it sounds like only about 20, 30 people would need the congregate shelter, but how do we decide who those 20 or 30 are going to be?
Yeah, so right now we have plans to work with the coalition and to work with outreach workers and to work with the clients specifically in the camps. Questions asked are, have you ever been in a non-congregate setting? Did you stay at the Aviator or the Alex last year? What was your success in that? Would you rather be in a congregate facility with, your friends or your associates? Those are questions that we ask, and it's kind of a mix of, what is the need and how can we address that need and what is the best fit for them? We know that through trial and error, there are going to be some people placed inappropriately in the beginning, and that's just something that we have to grapple with. But for the most part, I think because our population is so small, it's very well known who the clients are, what their needs are, have they fared well in the past at these facilities, and how can we best serve them moving forward. So I think there's going to be a lot of self-identification when working cohesively with the clients as well as outreach to determine what is the best place for that person. Also, shelters historically have been run by specific providers. And so we see great relationships being built with outreach workers or case managers or service providers. And maybe that person wouldn't have fared well in a non-congregate setting before, but because they're working with a contractor or a service provider that they've been with before, they might have a higher opportunity of success at that place. So it's just a lot of moving parts, a lot of navigation, but 400 people, that's a pretty small number.
No, it's fantastic, and you seem happy about it. It sounds really encouraging. What will happen on December 31st, 2023?
So we are working with the Assembly right now because our fiscal year ends December 31st. Our alcohol tax will fall back into a fund balance. We have our budget process happening right now in the municipality between the administration and the Assembly. And so I'm hoping with that, they will fund emergency cold weather shelter starting January 1st through the end of April. And we'll just continue, continuity of government and continuity of services at these locations, hopefully with no substantial impacts.
Are we fully staffed for what we're planning to do?
So this is something that we talk about, or at least I talk about quite often, is we ask providers to staff up facilities of, this size within 2 weeks. It's a very difficult process. And I think because it's such a difficult process in a small amount of time, we see very limited operators coming to the table, willing to do this amount of work for, honestly, not a lot of money. And so I think moving into the future, I've continued to discuss maybe we turn this into a year-round congregate shelter where it's between 100 and 150 people. And that way it gives shelter providers more of an opportunity to maintain staff because nobody wants to hire someone in October and lay them off in April. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, I believe they will be fully staffed. When the ITB comes out, they do commit contractually that they will be able to fully staff. And because we have less people seeking shelter this winter, I think we'll see really ease in operations this year, aside from last year.
Last question. Mm-hmm. Most folks that you would meet on the street would think that this past summer was bad mm-hmm. in Anchorage in terms of the amount of visible homelessness that we saw.
Absolutely.
It sounds very encouraging that lots of folks are going to have the opportunity to stay in non-congregate shelter, and then a very small number will stay in congregate shelter. That it'll be night and day difference between what we've had this summer and what we're approaching now.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just that the hotels will want to use their rooms for tourists and therefore that number of folks will be released back out and there just won't be a plan for them? Or is there any mechanism to continue what seems like a great plan through beyond just cold weather?
So historically, the providers that have offered non-congregate sheltering want to go back to tourist season and using their facilities for a higher, market rate for hotels in the summer. If we could identify a hotel conversion, something similar to the Guest House or to the Golden Lion, to where we could turn on housing, I think that work should be getting done throughout the emergency season. There is a mix of things in winter, not just going into shelter, but I think people, sometimes couch surf because it's cold, or they will, pick something that they often wouldn't pick in the summer. And so my goal, hopefully, is to continue the small congregate site through summer. I've been an advocate for that. I think with SWS, this facility that we're talking about bringing online, it's in a very unique location where it's not next to a neighborhood. So
yeah, can you tell us about the location?
Yeah, so it's located on at 1111 East 56th Avenue. It's in an industrial neighborhood, and it's right next to the brand new solid waste services building that was bonded for and built with.
And the building itself is the old solid waste service building?
It's the old administrative building. So all their HR, their accounting, everything was in there. So it's offices, and then attached to it is essentially like a big warehouse bay. And so we are going to convert the offices into navigation, outreach, corrective services, anything, getting people into treatment. All those offices will be used for that. And then for the sleeping facility, it will be in like the warehouse space. So I believe with a smaller site, with, heavy focus on this success of this facility, if we can pull it off successfully, no problems, I would hope that the Assembly would continue to fund it for the most vulnerable population that we would not like to see hit the streets come April 30th.
When will that facility be ready to go?
So we are shooting for October 16th, just like all the other facilities. We had our fire inspection, and so we're doing fire safety repairs right now, and then we're working with SWS to vacate the facility of inventory. So printers, fax machines, file folders, desks, chairs, stuff like that. So October 16th would be my goal, but I'm most likely going to see it in the week after that, in my suspicion. So,
Alexis Johnson, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to Hunter Lotzfeld for making this podcast listenable, and thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com. That's eastanchoragebookclub, all one word, @gmail.com.